Well, shifting over to Japan for a moment.
Yeah.
To Douglas MacArthur, who was Supreme Commander of Allied Powers. How was he looking at Korea and General Hodges
Right.
and his challenges there?
Well, in a loose sort of way, Korea was part of MacArthur's bailiwick, but he didn't take a whole lot of interest in it. I think he thought that Japan was plenty of a challenge, and that anything that furthered his ability to shape Japanese public opinion worked for him. In that case, getting Koreans out of Japan, getting them sent back to Korea was a good deal. Koreans in Japan were part of the Japanese Communist Party, part of certainly an opposition to the Yoshida government as it developed. After 1948, he had no responsibility at all, because now South Korea was an independent country, and so it became a State Department problem, basically. And even before then, to the degree it was an Army problem, it was done largely by Hodge with representatives of military government people in Washington who were supervising activities in Germany, Austria, any place where we had occupation forces. The Koreans were in a really strange position because technically they were Japanese citizens, which made them enemy aliens,
Right.
whether they were in the United States or wherever. I mean, the kind of anomalous problem of legitimacy and citizenship that people found very difficult to deal with. I ran into cases where we had Koreans who'd been part of OSS and been working for us in China, had temporary commissions in the U.S. Army. After the war was over, they said, well, we'd like to continue, but you're Japanese. Well, I'm not Japanese. I hate the Japanese. I'm a Korean. Well, yeah, but technically you're a Japanese citizen if you weren't born in the United States. Korean born in the United States, no problem. They're American citizens. But we had all kinds of Koreans in the United States and elsewhere who were serving America's interests, who were technically enemy aliens. And I'll tell you this, they had to go to Congress and work out, all kinds of arrangements, class actions, individual efforts of relief. There's no question that, let's say from MacArthur's standpoint, the Koreans were just another problem that he had to deal with, because the antipathy between the Japanese and the Koreans was huge, as it remains so today.
You mentioned the U.S. State Department a few moments ago during this period, particularly late 46, early 47. Yeah. What was going on with respect to Korea and Asia policies in general, and who were the department specialists, and how did they line up on the various issues?
Interesting question. We know about the purges of old China hands, McCarthyite attacks upon that group, and when it comes down to it, there are about 3 or 4 prominent State Department officials who get caught up in the being tainted red sort of position. And there are a lot of State Department officials who don't bear that onus. They may be, one guy, Walton Butterworth, was one of them. There's a whole list of people who have become Assistant Secretaries of State. There are people like Dean Rusk, become an Assistant Secretary of State for Far East Affairs, who managed to maneuver between both political parties. The State Department certainly came under attack for being pro-communist, being unsympathetic to right-wing interests, but there are quite a few people whose background is either China or Japan, who had pretty serious interest and knowledge of Korean affairs. The idea that somehow we didn't have Korea experts is simply not true. Many of them had been temporary officers in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II as linguists, the Japanese linguists. Many of them, or a substantial number, have been born and raised in Korea, missionary families, either Methodist or Presbyterian, been reserve officers. My family became close to the Underwoods, Horace and Dick Underwood, who were both military officers in the Korean War and World War II, worked for OSS and the like. Well, they, third generation of their family don't live in Korea. And it wasn't as if there weren't a number of people who knew a great deal about Korean politics and the Korean people. And the evidence is that Hodge and others listened to them. So it was not a matter of not knowing about the personalities, it's a matter of sort of intractable problem.
So there was some depth there. Can you tell us about the rush to Korean independence, the 1948 elections, which were held by the U.S. military government and the Korean interim government with the reluctant participation of the United Nations Temporary Commission?
Right.
How did Syngman Rhee gain the presidency?
Oh, by actually putting together a kind of independent political party. Rhee was a clever guy. I mean, he got a PhD from Princeton, so he learned something along the way. And one of the things he learned was that politics are not necessarily decided in the capital city. And so he paid a lot of attention to creating a nationwide network, loyal only to him, and having local, provincial, city representatives. I mean, he created a national party structure, which proved to be much stronger than some of these more traditional liberationist parties in South Korea. He wasn't the Americans' first choice. I mean, he was quite an operator, probably guilty of massive corruption. He got a lot of money from people who were not easily identifiable, particularly Korean businessmen, Japanese businessmen, some Americans. He extorted money from the exiled Korean population, put the arm on any Korean that lived in Hawaii or Southern California. He was pretty hard-handed in that matter.
Tell us about his wife.
Well, she was an Austrian expatriate, a big status, Asian man, white wife, big deal. But she was very active politically, very loyal to him. And she was somebody who'd sort of been anti-war, but then she got pro-Syngman Rhee along the way. He married her in the 30s and met each other in New York City.
She didn't like Americans, did she?
She did not like Americans.
Why was that? Do you know?
Well, I think she just thought our manners and treatment of her husband were out of hand. She was a true believer, clearly. Today she's buried next to the president in the big national cemetery in Seoul. She didn't die. Within my period of interest in Korea, which was sometime in the last 20 years or so. But she was quite une femme formidable, as the French would say. And she was, fortunately, she kept memoirs and letters, and there's a whole Syngman Rhee Study Institute in Seoul, which has not only his papers, but hers as well, so we get a real inside view of their activities as nationalist politicians. Very, very helpful.
Seems like a very resilient politician.
Oh, yeah. Well, they were, boy, I'll tell you, they knock them down, they pop up. You have to give the old man credit because he had a number of things going for him. One, he clearly had opposed foreign domination of Korea, first by the Chinese, then by the Japanese. He also sold himself as somebody who manipulated the United States. 3 college degrees from the United States. Oh, he was a Mandarin to the death. I mean, he was no more Korean than you and I are. I got the analogy wrong, but he pretended to be an American. It's like you and I pretend to be Koreans. Right. It doesn't work. And anyone who dealt with it got that pretty quickly. But he made friends, particularly in Washington. he sold himself as the only respectable, honest Korean nationalist, liberationist leader. The fact that he spoke English, we fall in love with people who speak English, but we can't handle their languages. So if they speak English, they must be really good guys, like the Somozas and Trujillo. We've had that problem in Latin America. And in hopes that we've got to get over that.
What were the security challenges facing the new government with the U.S. Army downsizing, trying to get out its forces on the peninsula, and the constabulary and the KNP,
Right.
the Korean National Police, effectively, which is effectively the new ROK Army?
Yeah. Well, we inherited a police force that had been formed by the Japanese. We fired the Japanese supervisors of the Korean National Police, but we inherited Koreans who'd been trained by the Japanese to be police. They're pretty heavy-handed, and they also tended to be very corrupt and politicized. And so they were into law enforcement of a sort, but there was an internal security threat from communist guerrillas, right-wing mutineers in the South Korean constabulary. There were some real serious security threats. Communists began to conduct operations in 1946 to embarrass the American occupation, theft, mostly arson, and sabotage. They didn't go out to kill Americans, but they certainly made life miserable. The constabulary was formed in early 1946 as basically an internal police force that would be militarized and provide tactical skills, weapon skills that we didn't want the Korean National Police to have. The deal was to try to keep American troops from having to put down riots. They did in 1946. American infantrymen shot Koreans, in the streets of a number of cities. And that didn't go down well anywhere, certainly not in Korea, but in the United States as well. So the idea was to pull American troops away from internal security policing and get the American troops out of Korea as rapidly as possible.
With the internal police rife with insurgent cells, how does Rhee hold his government together?
By intimidation and patronage, just about every tool. He'd have been a great mayor of Boston, I guess. Anything that worked, A lot of it was promising people jobs because that was a source of income. He had a tremendous knack of playing on people's ambitions and then using them and then casting them off somehow. And under the Korean Constitution, which gave the president a lot of power, much more than an American president, he could do that, and he wasn't at all reluctant to be very opportunistic in forming alliances. He tried not to commit himself to one distinct political party, shifted names and people around shamelessly. He's a very, very, very clever guy, and he gets, if you're just doing ability to coerce and manipulate, he gets pretty high marks for his activities. It's really quite true that sort of like Sukarno in Indonesia, for example, people who ride crest of national liberationist politics sentiment. He knew how to push all the right buttons, and he could be anti-Japanese when he had to be. He could be anti-Chinese. That didn't mean he didn't deal with them. The boy's rhetoric is pretty powerful. It's quite. You really go in and see how his government works, you find he's just trashing Japanese corporations, but on the other hand, he's encouraging them to invest in Korea, and which he gets a cut. So, he's a very clever guy.
Very resourceful.
Yes, indeed.
By early 1949, the Red Army had withdrawn from Korea.
Right.
Why was Stalin confident of eventual victory, that is, an all-communist Korea, or as you write, a strategic salient that protected both communist China and Asian Russia and represented a dagger pointed at the heart of a reborn pro-American Japan? What did Stalin see as his aces in the hole?
Well, I think he saw an influence in Korea, that is the Democratic People's Republic, through Kim Il-sung, who adored Stalin. Kim Il-sung got himself in trouble by continuing to be a Stalinist after that was not fashionable in Moscow. His big split with the Soviet Union came in the post-Stalinist era. He thought Stalin was fabulous, loved his methods. I'm going to do things just like Uncle Joe. He wasn't at all happy about having to ally himself with Kim Il-sung. He had the Korean fear of Chinese domination. And he didn't care whether they're communist or served an emperor or whomever. That having the Chinese in your business all the time was something as a Korean he couldn't abide. I think that Stalin saw this as a minor investment, low risk probably, a way to use Korea as a way to manipulate the Chinese if he had to, or the Japanese. The Koreans within Japan were kind of a fifth column still. I think he saw it as a pretty low risk activity. Stalin couldn't keep from fussing with anybody he could manipulate. But Yugoslavia, other Balkan states, he meddled constantly, I think that in the long run he thought that trying to unify Germany as a communist state was his ultimate foreign policy goal, but he wanted to have influence certainly on affairs in Asia largely as a way to provide some balance, be decisive in the relationship between Japan and China.
Can you tell us who Major General John B. Coulter was, and what were his views on South Korean security, and how were they different from MacArthur's and Army Chief of Staff Lawton Collins?
Well, Coulter is very much beloved in Korea. There are Army generals who served there. John McAllis is one, Jim Van Fleet's another, Coulter's another, who are big to Koreans. It's American who understood their problems and were sympathetic. So Coulter was a senior Army official between August of 1948 until July of 1949. And one of the things that Coulter advocated was keeping at least token American troops in Korea, which was in fact the State Department's position. But the Army had left behind a regimental combat team plus a support element, and they were placed at such a Uijeongbu corridor just north of Seoul, which is the main invasion route to take to get to Seoul. Thought was if that force stayed there would not have been an invasion in 1950. Coulter actually went back and helped with UN-sponsored reconstruction and rehabilitation in the latter stages of the war and in the period that followed it. He really had a solid record as a humanitarian. The Koreans held him in some considerable favor. And I think, unfortunately, he wasn't sort of an insider. The Army in this period was being run by veterans of the European War. Coulter was not. He served in the war with Japan. And the people who were in favor were largely those who had been part of the Bradley, Eisenhower, Joe Collins part of the Army, memorialized so usefully here in the museum.
Right.
If you think about it a minute, you're not going to find much about John Hodge or John Coulter.
Right.
Even in Marshall's papers, these guys are very able, but they're off in that other war. The one that counts is the one against Germany.
Right, right. Can you describe the visit of John Foster Dulles to South Korea in June 1950 Why was he there? What
Right.
did his visit mean to the Korean people?
Well, this was quite a dramatic episode. It comes about because Dulles had become appointed an ambassador at large to begin talks about a peace treaty with Japan. He wasn't Dean Acheson's first choice, but Acheson was convinced by others. I don't think General Mashall was involved, but they decided that Dulles, since he seemed to be the Secretary of State in waiting on the Republican side, and he'd been a very strong advocate of an independent Korea. He'd been eager to have the UN deal with Korean problems. And so everyone knew he was friendly to Korea. He knew Syngman Rhee personally. They call it the old Princetonians, I think, something like that. But in any event, it was the first time a major American envoy had actually gone to Korea first before going to Japan, which was his primary mission. He was actually negotiating with Douglas MacArthur over the content of the treaty. That's where the negotiations were. But Dulles made a very passionate speech a week before the invasion in June 1950, saying, "We're right behind you. There may be some misunderstanding that the United States won't defend Korea." This is the Acheson Press Club speech problem, which I think exaggerated. But in any event, the State Department realized there was a problem because Acheson's speech had been misinterpreted. What Acheson said was that this was now a U.S.-UN responsibility, that we weren't crossing off Korea. It just wasn't part of the war plan for a war with Russia if that happened. So it wasn't part of this island chain defense scheme. And it wasn't, but that didn't mean it didn't have other value. And so Acheson agreed to let Dulles go to Korea, and his speech was vetted. I mean, they knew exactly what he was going to say. I think Paul Nitze wrote it for him. But in any event, it was supposed to reassure the South Koreans that they had not been abandoned, and it was kind of a warning shot over the bow of North Korea. As far as we can tell, it didn't make any difference one way or the other.
And as you say, the war breaks out the next week.
Yeah.
If you want to find out more about that,
yeah.
you need to read Volume 2 of this excellent series. And do you have any words for us about Volume 3?
Yes,
where that
well,
stands?
I think the important word is it's just about finished.
Right.
There's nothing more embarrassing for any historian to be asked where he is on writing some book that he's been working on. Sometimes they're not working on them at all. That gets really embarrassing. My audience, there is a volume 3. It's only one chapter short now of being finished, and it's going to be, I fear, a doorstop like Volume 2. I think in terms of new perspectives and some new knowledge, it'll probably be the best of the 3 books, because as you know, Russ, what happens is that people write about the Korean War, get up to the negotiations, and then, oh, it's over. Well, there's about 2 years in there where the kind of interesting things going on. For example, I think the idea that the POW problem kept the war from being ended by negotiation is wildly exaggerated, and it started that way at the time because that's what the press was covering. Both sides are playing for time. On the Chinese side, they're developing a system of fortifications across the DMZ and all the way up both coasts, which still exists, which was what the Chinese called the equivalent of the Great Wall. And they weren't going to have an armistice until they were sure that they could defend North Korea and then withdraw and let the North Koreans defend North Korea. Because they had, Indochina, Tibet, they got some other things they're interested in, Formosa. So the Chinese are not going to quit until they're relatively sure this defense system is created. Then Stalin dies, and so their military aid suddenly starts to go away, and that becomes a major factor. For the United States, it has to do with the stability of the Syngman Rhee government and the South Korean army. And 4 divisions are effective in the Iraq Army in 1950, and when the war ends, I think there's 16 online. They're covering most of the DMZ. The plan was to have 20 divisions, and the whole idea was that the Iraq ground forces, supported by American naval and air forces, would defend South Korea, as it still does. And so those are really the big objectives on both sides. There isn't going to be an armistice until both sponsors are relatively sure that their clients now can stalemate each other.
Dr. Millett, thank you very much for being with us here today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We look forward to this evening.
Good, thank you.